The sun broke through the clouds, a dull and pale light seeping across the city's skyline. Jonathan Lawson walked out of his apartment, his shoes tapping against the pavement as he set off down the sidewalk. The city around him hummed with life, cars honking, people chatting, the distant rumble of the subway. But something felt off, like a subtle hum beneath the surface of reality, a heaviness in the air, a sense that things weren't as they should be. He didn't pay it much attention. It was a Tuesday and he was running late. As he reached the subway station, the usual crowd was there, bustling, jostling, lost in their own worlds. Jonathan stood at the edge of the platform, glancing at his watch. He was in no mood to deal with the chaos of the morning rush, but at least the train would be here soon. He moved closer to the edge of the platform, trying to position himself for the fastest entry, but as he nudged past a few commuters, something strange happened. The man in front of him didn't react. Jonathan gave him a sharper shove, just enough to catch his attention, but the man didn't flinch. His face remained blank, his eyes staring ahead with an almost vacant expression. Jonathan paused, confused. He blinked a few times, shaking his head. Maybe the man hadn't felt it. He moved again, this time tapping someone's shoulder. Nothing. She continued to stare ahead, completely unaware of him. He felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. He stepped back, surveying the crowd. Everyone moved in their own rhythm, their eyes straight ahead, their feet on autopilot. No one seemed to notice him. No one even acknowledged his presence. It was like he wasn't there at all. His heart rate spiked, a quick, jagged panic gripping him. He glanced around the platform again, this time waving his hands frantically, trying to catch someone's attention. A few people brushed by, their movements as fluid as though they were passing through a ghost. The train arrived, but Jonathan didn't get on. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his body trembling as the doors closed. The train rumbled away, and he was left standing alone on the platform, a growing sense of dread pooling in the pit of his stomach. He watched the next train arrive, almost as if it had been waiting for him, but he couldn't bring himself to board. What if no one would notice? What if it was all happening again? But he had no choice. He needed to get to work. He needed to be around people. He couldn't just stay here, stranded. The subway ride was worse. The car was crowded, but the people, there was no eye contact, no glances exchanged. Their eyes flicked past him like he was invisible, like a shadow lost in a room of ghosts. When he reached for the pole to steady himself, his hand passed through it, a brief shimmer of disbelief as his fingers passed through the metal without resistance. No one reacted. No one acknowledged. A dizzying wave of panic threatened to overwhelm him as the train rattled on, its rhythmic movement almost mocking him. The city skyline passed by outside, but it felt like he was drifting through some unseen space, a part of the world yet completely outside of it. When he stepped off the train at his stop, it felt no different. The streets were still busy, but the noise was distant, muffled. The faces of people as they walked past were blank, their gazes locked ahead, unaware of him. A group of tourists stood nearby, snapping photos, yet they didn't so much as look in his direction. Jonathan found himself walking faster, his steps quickening, his breath shallow as his pulse raced. Was he in a dream? Was this some kind of madness? How could they not see him? How could they not hear him? He tugged at his coat, yanked his sleeves, but the people around him didn't even seem to register his presence. A pair of teenagers passed by, laughing, talking about their plans for the weekend. Jonathan reached out, touched one of them on the arm, shaking it lightly to get their attention. Nothing. No response. They kept walking as if he weren't even there. It was as if the world was a stage and he was merely a shadow on the edge of it, out of sight, out of mind. The shadows around him began to change. It started with a faint sensation, something brushing against his skin, like cold fingers on his neck. But when he turned, there was nothing. The daylight was bright, but the shadows grew longer. They stretched farther than they should have, as though something was lurking just outside the boundaries of his vision. A flicker, a movement, figures, shadows shifting and stretching as he passed through the city streets, always at the edge of his sight. He wasn't alone, but they weren't human either. They followed him, lingering in his peripheral vision, silent, faceless. His legs carried him, driven by an anxiety he couldn't name. He darted into a cafe, trying to find shelter from the suffocating weight of being unnoticed. He approached the counter, desperate to make contact with the barista. But she didn't look at him. She didn't even pause in her work, making drinks as if he were just another gust of wind passing through the door. His throat tightened as he turned away. The people in the cafe continued with their mundane lives, their voices blending together, a hum of conversations he couldn't engage in, a noise he couldn't be part of. He stumbled out of the cafe, his legs unsteady, the world around him pulsing, thrumming like a distant heartbeat. The shadows around him had multiplied. Now, they weren't just at the edges of his vision. They were close. Close enough to feel their breath, cold on the back of his neck. He ran, faster and faster, until the world became a blur of indistinct faces, noise, and the press of humanity that refused to notice him. His apartment building loomed in the distance, the glass doors reflecting the faint light of the late afternoon. He moved toward it, dragging his feet, each step heavier than the last. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding as he pressed the button, the weight of his own body seemingly too much to bear. When he reached his floor, Jonathan staggered down the hallway. His apartment door was ajar. He stepped inside, the familiar space feeling more alien than ever before. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched toward him, and as he turned to face them, he felt a crushing realization settle over him. He wasn't just being ignored, he was forgotten. The room felt colder now, colder than he had ever remembered. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes falling on the things he knew best. His couch, the kitchen counter, his framed photos on the wall. But everything was suddenly distant, out of reach. The world was quiet, and yet there was a noise, soft like whispers, like a creaking floorboard that wasn't his own. He went to the window, pulling aside the curtain to look out into the street. Emergency vehicles were parked along the curb, police cars, ambulances. He blinked, confused, trying to make sense of the scene below. Then his breath caught in his throat. There, surrounded by the flashing lights and a crowd of officers, was his own body. A paramedic was carefully lifting the white sheet off the motionless figure. Jonathan's heart stopped. It was him. It was his own lifeless form. He hadn't been ignored. He hadn't been forgotten. He had never been seen at all because he was already gone. The shadows in the corners of his apartment grew darker, closing in. The figures that had followed him all this time, now they were here, waiting. Jonathan Lawson understood now. He wasn't lost in a crowd. He had never left the world at all. He had been walking among the living for weeks, maybe months, a ghost unaware of his own death. The realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. And as the shadows wrapped around him, he finally understood the truth. He wasn't invisible. He had simply ceased to exist in the world of the living. And now, no one could hear him. No one would ever hear him again.